React automatic and we burst and squeeze and make 9/11 each emergency. Urgency, ambulance erect like the turning leaf. Oh, please let the hurt cease. Don't let apathy police the populace. We will march across those stereotypes that were marked for us. The answer's obvious. We switch the consonants and change the thoughts to words and lift cotton and rise together. We rise together. We rise together.
As I always say, rise together or hang separately. Thank you for joining us on the September 1st, 2009 edition of Deadline Live. I'm your radio gun, Jack Blood. As always, you're listening to AmericanFreedomRadio.com and all of our great affiliates out there. Thank you all for picking up the program and supporting us. You're keeping us going, and we do appreciate that. Our guest here in the first hour is David Ray Griffin. He is a retired professor of philosophy and religion and theology. Along with John P. Kolb Jr., he founded the Center for Process Studies in 1973, which is a research center of Claremont School of Theology, which seeks to promote the common good by means of rational approach found in process thought. In other words, it is a center to study the process of thinking. Not a bad thing to have. Pretty good tool to have, in other words, when you're analyzing the thoughts centered around 9/11. And David Ray Griffin has become a forefather, you can call him, a leader in the 9/11 truth movement, a spokesperson, and always does an excellent job when he's called upon to do so. His books are numerous. The 9/11 Commission Report, Omissions and Distortions, 9/11 and the American Empire, Intellectuals Speak Out, of course, the New Pearl Harbor Revisited, and the latest, Osama bin Laden, dead or alive? I think we all know the answer to that. Now, last night I was sitting and watching TV, and I know, tisk, 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 Jack, what are you doing watching TV? You know that is a mind control device. You know that is filled with nothing but propaganda. But I had heard about this new hit piece coming out on the National Geographic channel, so I had to tune in. A self-inflicted wound, a self-flagellation. The show was 9/11 Science and Conspiracy. Of course, I call it 9/11 junk science and conspiracy. 3 people on the panel to rebut these really very lame experiments used to disprove any conspiracy theory and science related to 9/11. And the people on the panel were my guest, David Ray Griffin, also Richard Gage from Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth, Dylan Avery from Loose Change, and Professor Stephen Jones, who has actual physical evidence in his hands, which is completely ignored by the authors of this piece of crap hit piece. Excuse the terminology. David Ray Griffin, thank you for coming on the program. As always, I appreciate you being here.
Good to be with you, Jack.
So set this up for us. This has been in the works for quite some time. They kept showing you guys reviewing some of these so-called scientific experiments, which weren't very scientific, I might add, back in March. So this has been in the cooker for quite some time.
Yes, and now in retrospect, it looks like the goal was to get this show coming out just before 9/11 of this year, and to take 4 of the best-known members of the 9/11 Truth movement, that is myself and Stephen Jones and Richard Gage and Dylan Avery, and make us look silly. And actually what National Geographic did is just make itself look silly for anybody who knows, even 7th grade science.
Right.
The experiments they did were just ridiculous. I know people who used to say, I used to respect popular mechanics before they put out their ridiculous defense of the official story about 9/11. I think now people are going to start saying, I used to respect National Geographic.
Yeah, well, something happened right after 9/11. That is, Popular Mechanics was bought out. I had a lot of friends there. I used to go there, David, and just hang out in their offices because I had so many friends that worked there. They were all subsequently fired when they were bought out by a new chapter, a new group who use it as a debunking device, certainly. They sure did make themselves look silly, didn't they? I mean, anybody who has just the slightest understanding of controlled scientific experiments, such as the kind that yourself and Stephen Jones and Richard Gage write, peer-reviewed reports from Professor Stephen Jones, a physicist, Anyone that has even the slightest understanding would be offended that even any of this was even used as science. And I think that they were really going after kind of the dumbed-down American class out there who could just be swayed either way, no matter what they see.
Yeah, let me deal with two of the experiments. The other one is so obscure we couldn't even figure out what they were trying to say with it. And we kept asking them, and they couldn't explain it. But the two, let me start with the thermite one. What they did is they took a bag of ordinary thermite, put it up next to a steel column, set it on fire, and sure enough, it just burned out, did absolutely nothing to the steel. And we all could have told him that, even us non-scientists. And here's what was wrong with that. First of all...
Hey, let me get you to back off your phone just about 2 inches. That'll make the feedback, okay?
Okay.
Okay, go ahead.
First of all, there's an enormous distinction between thermite, ordinary thermite, which has been around for 100 years or so, and nanothermite, which is quite a new invention. And it's a qualitative difference because ordinary thermite is an incendiary. It heats things, it sets, it starts fires. Nanothermite is not only an incendiary, it's a high explosive. So it is qualitatively different. As one person put it, ordinary thermite, you put it in your car engine, it'll burn a hole in it. Put nanothermite in there to blow the whole car apart. And yet, to disprove the idea that nanothermite brought the buildings down, they put this bag of thermite next to a piece of steel, ordinary thermite, and burn it and see, thermite does nothing. There were two other things wrong with that. Stephen Jones, who's talked about thermite and nanothermite a lot, always distinguishes between ordinary thermite and ordinary thermate. Thermate has sulfur added to it and greatly lowers the temperature at which steel will melt. They didn't even use thermate. They just used ordinary thermite. And then another factor is if you're going to take thermite or thermate and melt steel, you've got to turn it into a shaped charge.
Yeah.
And that's discussed in all of our writings. And yet that was not a shaped charge. That was an unshaped bag of thermate. So, this is the level. And any scientist looking at that who knows, say, you guys are ridiculous. You don't even know what you're talking about.
Dr. Griffin, let me give my listeners an example. I suspect that, one of my enemies blew up my mailbox with a stick of dynamite. I found some dynamite residue in the mailbox. I have that in my possession. The debunkers say, well, look, let's put a little firecracker in your mailbox and see if it will blow up. Well, it didn't blow up, so therefore dynamite didn't blow up your mailbox. I mean, it's apples and oranges, isn't it?
Jack, that is really funny because that was the next point I was going to make. Exactly.
All right.
Not your mailbox, but just the difference between dynamite and a firecracker. It's about the same as between ordinary thermite and nanothermite.
Which they point out that our children use on their 4th of July sparklers.
Yeah. Now, let me go to the other one. This one takes a little more time. Oh, and let me read you, first of all, before I leave that, a letter I got from Stephen Jones just a couple of weeks ago. Now, see, he had been interviewed for the show, but then when they did this, inviting us into the studio, he couldn't come that week. And so he wasn't there, and he recommended they replace him with Kevin Ryan so we would have a scientist there. They didn't do that.
No.
So they had 3 non-scientists to look at 3 pseudoscientific experiments. We knew enough to say these are ridiculous, but we couldn't say it with any authority, and anything good we've said they could just edit out anyway.
Which they did, yeah.
So here's what Stephen wrote. I had made the distinction in a letter to somebody that I copied to him, and he said, "Thank you, David. Again, the distinction which debunkers fail to admit between thermite, incendiary, and nanothermite, explosive, not a subtle difference. I painstakingly and repeatedly explained the difference to my interviewer. I don't know how I could have been any clearer in my plea to him to make the necessary distinction between thermite and nanothermite." And, of course, it was not in the interviewer's interest to make that distinction.
Well, it's not in the military's interest to provide super thermate or nanothermate for their little experiment here in National Geographic.